Welcome to NoCap Game Design. In this episode, we look at the 7th level of Halo Combat Evolved, titled The Library. In this level, the Master Chief has to run for his life as he follows this sassy blue light named the Guilty Spark. Behind the player, the Flood gives chase. Ahead, the Flood lies in ambush. The first thing that's noticeable about this level is how dark it is. It takes place entirely in this dungeon that is clearly designed to maximize dark corners with a lighting strategy that's only good at ruining a player's night vision. But these dark corners have a purpose. The developers have stuffed them full with zombies, scripted to ambush the player. As the player progresses, the Guilty Spark speeds off into the distance to mark the next checkpoint. This level is, let's say, unique for a lot of reasons, but it gives me an opportunity to talk about player attention. Even within just these first few moments of the level, the player has had to whip the camera around, forward, behind, to the side, then above. To be explicit, let me break down the play loop of this level. Chasing behind the player is the Flood, which requires a player to constantly look behind them to deal with this threat. But then the player can't look where they're going, and they may fall into a chasm, an ambush, or a dead end. This is more or less a linear hallway level, so enemies are mostly reserved to either in front or behind the player. Still, it's hard both to watch your front and back at the same time. Additionally, the Guilty Spark is floating high above the player, so attention is further pulled into a third direction, away from the ground level threats. And as I said before, this level is dark, making it easy to miss key details, which further strains a player's frayed attention. The player must budget their attention and have total mastery over the camera in order to play this level. The level seems to be designed to test these two skills, camera control and player attention, more so than other levels in the game so far. This is an effective technique to generate content or levels in your games. Pick an affordance, or a skill that a player uses during typical gameplay, and design an encounter that tests that specific affordance. For example, this level, the library, is forcing a player to look in several directions all at the same time, and the emphasis is less on finding cover or superior positioning and more on camera control. Much like level 3, the Truth and Reconciliation, or as I like to call it, the Nighttime Sniper Rifle level, that level was built around the, well, sniper rifle, and testing the player's ability to aim properly. This level is very similar to level 3. Both levels are dark, both levels demand precise camera control, both levels are stressing similar affordances. But in level 3, the player is ambushing the aliens, and in level 7 here, the player is being ambushed. So in this level, the developers are presenting a skill challenge to a player. In this case, the skill is player attention or camera control, which are kind of synonymous in first-person perspective games. The way the devs test the skill is by presenting multiple high-important targets to the player at the same time. Some targets are threats, like enemies or pitfall traps. Some targets are helpful, like health packs, guns, or the Guilty Spark. But everything is working to pull the player's attention in different directions. And it's dark. This is a tough skill check level. Next, I want to talk about the architecture of this level. While the hallways are linear, this level is not. This is best explained with an example. At this point in the level, the player is following the main path, and some eager infection class Flood gives the player motivation to quickly make progress. But this is a dead end. There's nowhere to go. If there were more than just these little guys chasing me, I would be in trouble. This is early in the level where the developers first introduced this kind of dead-end trap, so the player is okay when they fall into it. But in a few minutes, the consequences will be much more serious. Here's the key part of this example. Notice there is an endless spawn of these infection class Flood at this dead end. These little guys push the player, telling the player they have to keep moving or waste resources on this endless stream. Eventually, the player will wander over to this bright blue light and the wall opens up to show the true forward path. This example continues, however. Immediately beyond the door, the path tees. The Guilty Spark quickly moves to the right and disappears. If you're not paying attention or are distracted with combating an enemy Flood, you'll miss it. And if you go the wrong way, again, the developers deploy the endless spawn of Flood to nudge the player back to where they came from. The architecture of this level is designed to be confusing. The dead ends, dark corners, and crossroads make it hard for a player to see more than a few meters ahead. Additionally, the only signpost for the player, the Guilty Spark, moves fast and often disappears. It's easy to get lost if the player isn't constantly looking out for the blue light. And from the previous discussion, the player's attention is already being spread thin. A new player is going to get lost. A lot. Now, there have been maze-like levels before in this game, even dark indoor settings. So what's different about this level? Well, previously there has always been a very strong signpost that signaled to a player where to go. Enemy presence. Typically, if you're killing aliens, you're going in the right direction. This level, the library, however, throws that pattern out of the window. Enemies are no longer pulling a player forward into the level, but instead are pushing a player through it. In a game about killing aliens, this is a pretty major change. Instead of running towards the enemies, the player is supposed to run away from them. Notice, the Flood Infection class from earlier endlessly spawn in the dead ends. This seems to be a force to convince the player to go the other way. But for the entire game so far, the player has been trained to run towards enemies to make forward progress. The signaling in this level is self-consistent. Throughout the entire level, enemies act mostly as a push force instead of a pull force. But this level is inconsistent with the rest of the game. Perhaps this was intentional. One way to define a game is an authored experience. If the devs wanted the player to feel uncomfortable, off balance, or otherwise spooked, then this design choice would make sense. Design is a tool. Typically, the assumption is that good design is better than bad design, but that's not true. As a developer, you can intentionally employ techniques that would be considered bad design in order to achieve a specific goal. In this level, for example, it feels different from the rest of the game. There's a fundamental design conflict going on between the library and the rest of the game. This conflict translates into the gameplay itself and ultimately manifests as a deeply unsettling and unnatural play experience for a player. Now, a natural question would be, why would I ever want to play or make a game that is unsettling? But this is a question of personal preference. Why would anyone ever want to watch a scary movie or read a book about unnatural zombies? Many games are trying to be entertaining. A majority of those try to achieve this by being fun, but that's not the only way to be entertaining. Being scary or suspenseful or sometimes even boring, I'm looking at you, Solitaire, are all ways for a game to be entertaining. There's nothing inherently wrong with being boring or unsettling or scary as long as it achieves its initial design goals of, well, whatever it was designed for. Probably entertainment, but maybe to teach children math or convince people to buy a product. It doesn't really matter. Design is a tool. In summary, the library is a level that presents a fundamental design conflict with the rest of the game. Specifically, enemies are acting as a push force instead of a pulling signpost. This design conflict may be intentional. We'll never know unless we ask the developers directly. However, we can notice the effect this conflict has on gameplay. Namely, it makes the level uncomfortable, unnatural, and downright scary. Design is a tool. It can be used for good or bad. Both are acceptable in certain situations. What's important is that you, as a designer, use this tool intentionally and not accidentally. Enough hoity-toity academics, let's get back to the field notes. This level also presents a few good examples of environmental hazards, pitfalls, enemy spawn points, and other traps. What's specifically interesting to me is how the developers introduce these traps. Consider this simple pitfall trap. Not really super dangerous, more just a trench cut across the player's path, but it can cause problems if a player isn't careful. For the players that fall here, it's not all bad news. There's a power-up, an overshield, in the trench. This is the first time the trench is introduced, and the developers are attempting to lighten this first blow. So they mix in a little bit of the bad and the good together. This way, it doesn't feel unfair to a player experiencing the trap for the first time. There was some upside to falling into it. Another way to think about this, it's not fun to fall into a trap, and especially a new one the player was unprepared for. It may seem unfair because it is. So by providing a power-up, bonus, or something generally positive for the player, it will even things out. A little good balances out the bad. Going forward, the player is then expected to dodge the traps and suffer if they don't. But the first time, they're rewarded for falling into the trap. The developers have been using this technique throughout the game, I just haven't found an opportunity to talk about it until now. Generally, when introducing a new enemy, hazard, or problem to the player, it usually comes with a benefit or boost too. In earlier levels, the developers would inject extra computer allies, like when they introduced the Hunters and the Invisible Elites for the first time in Level 3. And various other points throughout the game, a little extra power-up helps to incentivize the player to jump into new challenges. However, here in the library, there are no other marine allies, but the technique is the same. With a new threat, the developers provide an extra bonus for the first time. The Halo devs also scale the difficulty of encounters as the level progresses. For example, in this level, there are 2 combat rooms where the player has to survive several minutes of close combat flood fighting. The first combat room is hard, to say the least. Not much cover, endless combat class flood, and no checkpoints. The second combat room, however, is the exact same, except now there is a big trench running through the middle of the room. In this way, the developers are reusing assets and therefore save on development time, and more importantly, the player gets a natural difficulty ramp, which makes this reused asset feel fresh and engaging. Win-win. Reusing assets like this isn't inherently a bad thing if you're doing it properly. However, if you are going to reuse assets or encounters, determining exactly what should be changed and by how much is more of an art than a science. But learn from the Halo devs here, sometimes a little goes a long way. Too much change and the player won't be able to connect the 2 encounters conceptually, effectively making it an entirely new encounter with a new learning curve and new frustrations. But too little change and the player may get bored with the tedium of it all. Here, the devs simply add a trench and call it good. But this is a good chance to practice game design. Was this enough of a change? What would a third version of this room include? What would you do if you were designing this level? Let me know in the comments. That's it for this episode. A little shorter than usual, partly because most of the things that I want to talk about I've already discussed in previous levels. I encourage you to check them out if you haven't done so already. But mostly, this is a short episode because I'm moving, so I had other responsibilities to take care of in the real world. In the next episode, we return to a familiar wintertime environment, but this time, the Master Chief will have to contend with the Flood and Covenant. I'll see you there.
And will cut through a number of primary systems. We need to trigger a detonation on a large scale, however.